15 most tragic deaths of black celebrities in Hollywood. Some stars seemed too powerful to fall, too beloved to leave, too unforgettable to vanish in such devastating ways. But behind the fame were final moments filled with shock, silence, betrayal, and loss that still haunt Black Hollywood. Tonight, we revisit the lives cut short and the endings the world still struggles to accept. Before we begin, subscribe to Black Legends Revealed and stay with us until the final name. Aaliyah. The cameras had already stopped rolling in the Bahamas when the last hours of Aaliyah's life narrowed into one terrible decision. She had just finished filming Rock the Boat. Her self-titled third album had arrived that July and debuted at #2 in the United States. Romeo Must Die had already pushed her onto movie screens. Queen of the Damned was completed, and more film work was waiting ahead. At 22, she carried herself with a calm that made everything around her look effortless, but the timing of her life told a different story. Music was opening wider. Film was opening wider. She was no longer approaching a bigger chapter. She was already stepping into it. On August 25th, 2001, she boarded a Cessna 402B at Marsh Harbor for the flight back to Florida. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff, killing Aaliyah and the 8 other people aboard. Investigators later found the aircraft had been substantially overloaded, and reporting after the investigation showed the pilot was not certified to fly that aircraft. Toxicology later found traces of cocaine and alcohol in his system. How do you make peace with a loss that should never have been asked of anyone in the first place? What stays with people is how unfinished everything around her looked. The album had only just begun its run. The video shot on that trip became inseparable from the trip itself. The screen career people were beginning to picture for her never had time to settle into shape. Aaliyah had that rare kind of presence that felt modern without chasing trends and quiet without ever fading into the background. She left at the exact moment when her reach was widening, and that is why her name still lands with such weight whenever people talk about the cruelest losses in black entertainment. Kobe Bryant and Gianna Bryant. That Sunday began with a routine he had come to love more than any championship parade. Kobe was headed to a girls' basketball game with Gianna, the daughter who had turned competition into something joyful again. Retirement had not dimmed him. It had redirected him. He was building stories, winning an Oscar for Dear Basketball, shaping books for young readers, teaching, guiding, showing up at gyms with the same intensity that once filled arenas. Beside him was the child who made that second life feel even larger. Gianna was 13, sharp-eyed, fearless, already reading the floor with a confidence that made people lean forward when she played. He spoke about her future the way fathers do when pride slips out before caution can stop it. The helicopter lifted into heavy fog over Southern California on January 26, 2020. They were traveling to the Mamba Sports Academy in Thousand Oaks, where Gianna was expected to play that morning. 7 others were on board. The route that should have ended at a basketball court never made it there. Instead, the aircraft went down in the hills near Calabasas, and everyone aboard was killed. Later findings pointed to the pilot entering cloud cover and becoming disoriented. What do you even do with a morning that begins with youth basketball and ends in silence heard around the world? The scale of public grief came fast, but the hardest part sat inside the ordinary shape of the day. This was not a farewell tour, not one last grand appearance under lights, not a man chasing applause. It was a father taking his daughter to a game. That detail kept cutting through everything else. The 5 championships, the 81-point night, the black and gold mythology, the fierce persona that made him seem carved out of something harder than most people ever touch. All of it fell away for a moment, and what remained was a parent and a child moving toward something small, familiar, almost tender. Gianna's name stayed there too, where it belonged. Not as an afterthought beside a legend, but as a young player with her own road opening up her own habits, her own hunger. The day took 2 futures at once, and people still speak of them together because neither story feels complete without the other. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye spent years turning private hurt into music people could live inside. By the time the early 1980s arrived, his voice had already carried romance, protest, longing, temptation, prayer. What's Going On had changed the language of soul. Sexual healing had pulled him back into the light. He should have been standing in a season of renewal. Instead, the most dangerous place in his life was the house where he had returned to recover. He moved back into his parents' home in Los Angeles, worn down by drugs, tax problems, broken relationships, and a mind that never seemed to settle for long. The man inside that house was not the polished figure the public heard on the radio. He was exhausted, jumpy, spiritually bruised, desperate for rest, and trapped again under the roof of the father who had shadowed his life with fear for years. Marvin Gaye Sr. was stern, domineering, easily angered, and impossible to please. Their history had been building towards something ugly long before that final morning arrived. On April 1st, 1984, the argument was small, at first the kind of domestic irritation that should have burned out in minutes. Missing papers, raised voices. His mother caught in the middle. Then the pressure inside that home broke open. Marvin stepped in to defend her, and the fight with his father turned physical. A short time later, Marvin Gaye Sr. used the handgun Marvin himself had bought for him and fired into his son's chest. One more shot followed. Marvin collapsed in the bedroom one day before his 45th birthday. How do you carry a life that ends in your own family's hands? He was not taken by a stranger in some distant place. He was killed in the home he had gone back to while trying to steady himself. A man who had filled records with tenderness, regret, desire, and spiritual ache died inside the oldest wound in his life. When people talk about tragic deaths in black entertainment, Marvin's name stays near the top because the violence came from the one bond that is supposed to hold before all others. The records kept playing, the house remained. And the silence around that ending never really lifted. Whitney Houston. Down the hall, people were getting dressed for one of the music industry's biggest nights. Makeup lights were on, dresses were being zipped, publicists were moving from room to room. In the middle of that polished Grammy weekend at the Beverly Hilton, Whitney Houston was inside a hotel suite where everything had gone strangely quiet. That setting made the loss harder to shake. She had spent so much of her life in rooms built for applause that it felt almost unreal for the story to end in a place meant for rest. Long before that afternoon, Whitney had already become a figure people spoke about with the kind of awe usually reserved for once-in-a-generation voices. Her debut made her a star. Whitney made her unavoidable. The Bodyguard pushed her into a level of fame few singers ever touch. And I Will Always Love You turned into the kind of song that can stop a room within seconds. Even after years of strained public scrutiny and the damage left by addiction, there were still moments when people believed she might steady herself and find another chapter worth holding on to. She still had that face, that tone, that history, that pull. She still walked into a room carrying all the memory of who she had been. Then the day narrowed. Whitney was in Los Angeles for Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy gathering, the same kind of industry ritual she had once ruled without effort. Instead of walking into that evening, she was found unresponsive in the bathtub of her hotel room. The official findings later pointed to accidental drowning with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. How do you stand in a city full of music and accept that a voice like that can disappear before night even falls? What stays behind is the cruel timing of it. The party still happened. The Grammys still went on. Tributes began almost immediately, as if the world had to race to catch up with something it refused to believe. Jennifer Hudson sang for her the next night, and millions watched with the shock still fresh. Whitney had filled arenas, award shows, radios, weddings, heartbreaks, funerals, car rides, church services, and living rooms for decades. Then her final image became a hotel room, an unfinished weekend, and a ceremony waiting downstairs. Michael Jackson. On the night of June 24, 2009, Michael Jackson was inside Staples Center running a full rehearsal for This Is It, the London comeback that had grown from a handful of dates into 50 sold-out nights at the O2 Arena. Dancers, musicians, aerial rigs, costume changes, film cues, all of it was finally taking shape around him. He had spent decades turning pop music into spectacle on a scale almost no one else could reach. Off the Wall had pushed him into a different league. Thriller stayed at #1 for 37 weeks, and the videos for songs like Billie Jean Beat It and Thriller changed what television expected from a music star. By then, he was 50, still thin, still exacting, still moving through rehearsal with the old instinct to control every beat, every entrance, every light. People around him believed the run in London could reset the story of his final years. A few hours later, the stage was gone, and the attention turned back to the house in Holmby Hills, where he had been trying to sleep. Propofol, an anesthetic meant for carefully monitored medical settings, had become part of that routine. On June 25th, he stopped breathing there. Paramedics were called. He was taken to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center and pronounced dead at 2:26 that afternoon. The coroner later found acute propofol intoxication with sedatives contributing and ruled the death a homicide. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in prison. How do you absorb a loss that happens between a triumphant rehearsal and the next afternoon's headlines? What makes this one stay lodged in public memory is the unfinished machinery around it. Tickets had vanished almost as soon as they went on sale. London was waiting. The set list was waiting. The wardrobe, the transitions, the giant production built to carry him back in front of nearly 1 million people was waiting. Then the footage of those rehearsals became something else entirely, a record of a man preparing for an opening night he never reached. His memorial at Staples Center drew more than 31 million U.S. television viewers, and even that number only hints at the scale of the stop he caused. He had built a career out of entrances no one could ignore. The final exit came before the curtain rose again. Chadwick Boseman. For millions of people, Chadwick Boseman arrived as a king before they ever knew how much pain he was carrying. By the time Black Panther exploded in 2018, he was no longer simply an actor with a strong run of roles behind him. He had already stepped into the lives of Jackie Robinson, James Brown, and Thurgood Marshall with a kind of discipline that made each performance feel measured, deliberate, earned. Then came T'Challa, and suddenly children were crossing their arms in school hallways. Parents were taking pictures in theater lobbies, and a character from a comic book had turned into something families wanted to hold on to. What the public did not see was that the battle had started long before Wakanda filled movie screens. Chadwick had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 2016. Surgeries followed. Chemotherapy followed. Hospital visits came and went while the cameras kept rolling. During those years, he filmed Marshall Black Panther Avengers, Infinity War Avengers Endgame, 21 Bridges, Da 5 Bloods, and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. He was traveling learning lines, wearing costumes, carrying entire scenes, and doing it while his body was being pushed in directions most people would never survive privately, let alone under studio lights. How many people could stand in the center of that kind of spotlight and still keep their suffering to themselves? That question sits inside every image from those final years. There he was at press events on red carpets, visiting children with cancer, speaking softly, smiling for photographs, giving audiences no easy sign of what was happening beneath the clothes and posture. Even the conversations about his weight in 2020 missed the truth. People speculated from a distance because they did not know he was already deep into a fight that had turned far more serious. On August 28, 2020, Chadwick Boseman died at home in Los Angeles with his wife and family beside him. He was 43. The news hit with the force of something people had never prepared themselves to hear, partly because his illness had remained so closely held, partly because he had kept working, as though time could still be stretched by will alone. His final films stayed behind like sealed rooms, opening one by one after he was gone, each of them carrying the weight of effort the audience had never been asked to witness. Naya Rivera. The boat was still out on Lake Piru when the day began turning wrong. Naya Rivera had rented a pontoon with her 4-year-old son Josie on July 8, 2020, and by late afternoon, staff found the boat drifting with the child asleep on board and Naya gone. 5 days later, her body was recovered from the lake. The Ventura County medical examiner ruled the death an accident caused by drowning, found no traumatic injuries, and said there was no indication drugs or alcohol played a role. That ending hit so hard because her life on screen had always carried motion, bite, and spark. She had worked since childhood, but Glee made her impossible to overlook. As Santana Lopez, she did far more than deliver sharp lines and musical numbers. The role turned into something people held on to for years, especially viewers who saw in Santana one of television's rare queer Latina characters, written with heat, pride, humor, anger, and vulnerability. By the time Naya published her memoir, Sorry Not Sorry, in 2016, and returned to acting with Step Up High Water, she had already built the kind of connection that follows a performer long after a hit series ends. The details from the lake are what people never stopped carrying. Investigators said Josie told them his mother helped him back onto the boat, and officials later said they believed she used the strength she had left to get him up before she disappeared beneath the water. What mother does not spend her last strength that way? That is the image attached to her name. Now, not a set, not a red carpet, not a recording booth, but open water, a drifting rental boat, and a child who made it back. She was 33. She had years ahead of her, a son still small enough to fall asleep waiting, and a body of work already rooted in people's memory. When her story comes up in conversations about the cruelest losses in Black entertainment, it is that final stretch of effort on the lake that keeps her there. Tupac Shakur. Las Vegas was still loud from the Mike Tyson fight when Tupac climbed into the black BMW beside Suge Knight on the night of September 7, 1996. Hours earlier, he had been inside the MGM Grand, moving through a crowd that already treated him like more than a rapper. By then, he had become a figure people argued over, quoted, feared, defended, and followed with unusual intensity. He could sound confrontational one minute and painfully exposed the next. Songs like Dear Mama, Keep Ya Head Up, and California Love had made him impossible to pin down in one shape. He brought politics into rap without sanding off the anger, and he brought vulnerability into it without losing force. That mix gave him a kind of presence that felt larger than celebrity, as if every appearance carried heat before anything even happened. Then the car stopped at a red light on Flamingo Road. A white Cadillac pulled up beside them. Gunfire tore into the passenger side. Tupac was hit multiple times. He was rushed to University Medical Center, where doctors fought to keep him alive through surgeries, sedation, and 6 long days of uncertainty before he died on September 13th at 25. What kind of future gets cut off at 25 and still feels too large to measure? People have returned to that question for years because his death never felt like the end of a settled story. It felt like the violent interruption of a voice still expanding in every direction at once. He had already moved through music, film, political language, and cultural myth with a speed that made ordinary career timelines look useless around him. The murder investigation itself only deepened the shadow hanging over it. For decades, the killing stood as one of the most notorious unsolved cases in entertainment. With the triggerman still unidentified, even after a murder charge was finally brought against Dwayne "Keffy D. Davis in 2023. What remains fixed is the image of that red light, that car door, that burst of bullets, and a life that seemed to be racing forward faster than the country knew how to absorb. The Notorious B.I.G. Just after midnight in Los Angeles, Christopher Wallace was leaving a music industry party at the Peterson Automotive Museum riding in a GMC Suburban with his security team, while the city was still buzzing from the after-hours glow that follows big events. Within minutes, another car pulled alongside. Shots came through the passenger side. and the man the world knew as the notorious B.I.G. was mortally wounded. He was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and pronounced dead on March 9, 1997, at only 24 years old. The murder was never solved, and the FBI later opened a civil rights investigation that was closed in 2005. What made that night cut so deeply was how much of his future was already gathering around him. Ready to Die had come out in 1994 and turned Juicy and Big Papa into part of rap's permanent vocabulary. His writing had weight without sounding slow humor, without losing menace detail, without wasting a bar. He could make Brooklyn feel block by block, apartment by apartment, dream by dream. By early 1997, he was no longer simply a star from New York. He had become one of the central voices shaping where hip-hop was heading next, and his second album, Life After Death, was about to arrive later that month. How are you supposed to hear a title like Life After Death the same way once the man behind it is gone before it even reaches the world? That question hangs over everything connected to Biggie's final days. Tupac Shakur had been killed only 6 months earlier, and the East Coast-West Coast hostility around rap had already poisoned the atmosphere around both names. Biggie stepped into Los Angeles carrying that history with him, and when he was shot after the party, the sense of unfinished business around his life became inseparable from the violence around the culture itself. Then the album came out on March 25, 1997, and songs that should have sounded like momentum immediately took on the shape of aftermath. He left behind a voice that sounded fully formed, a second record that landed like a message sent too late, and a car stopped in the dark with no ending anyone could put back together. Prince? The elevator at Paisley Park should have been carrying Prince to another room in a building shaped entirely by his will. Instead, on the morning of April 21st, 2016, that elevator became the place where his body was found unresponsive only days after an emergency landing in Illinois had already signaled that something was terribly wrong. He was 57. By then, he had spent 4 decades moving through music with a kind of control that seemed almost unnatural. Writing, producing, arranging, performing, changing styles whenever he pleased, then making those changes sound effortless. Purple Rain, 1999, Sign of the Times, the Symbol Era, the battles over ownership, the vault of unreleased songs, the midnight performances, the after-shows that felt half rumor and half miracle. His career never settled into one lane long enough for anyone else to define it. What makes the ending so brutal is how private the damage had become. For years, the physical price of those performances had been building in his body. The jumps, the spins, the landings, the long nights on stage had left him with chronic pain, especially in his hips, and the relief he turned to was not relief at all. On April 15, 2016, his plane made an unscheduled landing in Moline, Illinois, and he was treated there after what people around him understood as an opioid overdose. He was given Narcan, revived, and released. Friends and advisors were urging him toward treatment, trying to pull him toward a safer path while he was still close enough to reach. How many geniuses keep creating while their body is already sending its final warnings? 6 days later, the search inside Paisley Park ended at that elevator. The medical examiner later concluded that Prince died from an accidental fentanyl overdose. The pills he had taken were counterfeit, pressed to resemble prescription medication, but carrying something far deadlier. That detail still lands with a special cruelty. He was inside the compound he built, surrounded by instruments, recordings, rehearsal space, unfinished work, and the archive of a lifetime. Yet the thing that killed him had arrived, disguised as help. Fans gathered outside the gates in purple radio stations, changed their playlists within hours, and the building he had turned into a world of his own suddenly looked like a sealed chamber holding songs he would never get to release himself. Bobby Christina Brown. 3 years after Whitney Houston was found dead in a hotel bathtub, her daughter was discovered face down in a bathtub in her own Georgia townhome. Bobby Christina Brown was only 22. She had grown up under flashbulbs as the only child of Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, stepping in and out of red carpet's television appearances, and a family story the public never stopped watching. There had been talk of music acting and building something with her own name on it. But by 2015, her life was already tangled up with grief addiction around her family strain and a level of scrutiny that left very little room to fall apart in private. On January 31st, 2015, she was found unresponsive in the water and rushed to the hospital. Her heartbeat was restored, but she never came back to the life she had been living that morning. She remained under medical care for months before dying on July 26, 2015. The medical findings later showed drug intoxication and immersion of her face in water contributed to her death. But investigators were unable to determine whether what happened was accidental, intentional, or caused by someone else. How do you separate one young woman's tragedy from the shadow of the house she was born into? That question follows her story everywhere because the facts alone already feel unbearable. Her mother had died in a bathtub in 2012. Bobby Christina was still a teenager then, and the collapse that followed never seemed to fully stop. By the time she was found in 2015, the public was no longer looking at a celebrity daughter with a future ahead of her. They were looking at a second generation pulled toward the same darkness with the same family name attached and with the same helpless feeling that the warning signs had been there long before the final day arrived. Her estate later won a wrongful death judgment against Nick Gordon in civil court, but he was never criminally charged in her death. That left the story suspended in the worst possible place. A young woman gone, a family shattered again, a public still staring at the repetition of it, and no ending clean enough to settle anything. Nipsey Hussle. It happened in the middle of the afternoon out in the open at the exact corner where Nipsey Hussle had decided his success needed to live. On March 31st, 2019, he was standing outside Marathon Clothing near Slauson Avenue and Crenshaw Boulevard, the store he had opened in June 2017 in the neighborhood that had shaped him. He was not tucked away behind gates or living at a distance from the place that made his name. He stayed visible there, moving through the same streets, building on the same ground, putting money back into the area instead of only talking about it in songs. By then, the music had already carried him into a different tier. After years of mixtapes, Victory Lap arrived in February 2018 and earned a nomination for Best Rap Album at the 61st Grammy Awards. Around that same period, he helped open Vector 90, a co-working and STEM center in South Los Angeles. Another sign that he was trying to build something sturdier than celebrity. People could hear ambition in his records, but they could also see what he meant by ownership. The store, the neighborhood investment, the local jobs, the habit of staying close to home even after fame arrived, those details changed the meaning of everything that happened next. How do you watch a man return to lift up his own block and then see that same block become the place where he falls? A brief conversation took place outside the store that day. Minutes later, Eric Holder Jr. came back with guns and opened fire in the parking lot, killing Nipsey and wounding 2 other men nearby. Nipsey was pronounced dead that afternoon at age 33. Holder was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 60 years to life. The hardest part of his story sits right there in the setting. He had invested nearly $2.5 million into that lot. He was known in Crenshaw not only for rap, but for civic work businesses and plans that reached beyond himself. The life ended where the rebuilding was supposed to continue, with the storefront still standing and the vision around it suddenly left unfinished in daylight. Sam Cooke. A little after 3 in the morning on December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was lying dead on the floor of the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles, wearing a sports jacket and one shoe, his body marked by a gunshot wound to the chest. The man who had sung with such ease about devotion, longing, joy, and change did not die on a stage in a limousine or inside some grand mansion built by fame. He died in a cheap motel office after a night that never stopped sounding wrong. By then, Cooke had already altered the shape of American music. He began in gospel with the Soul Stirrers, then crossed into pop and rhythm and blues with a smoothness that helped rewrite what a black artist could sound like to the wider country. You Send Me made him a star. Cupid Twistin' the Night Away and Chain Gang made him a fixture. Behind the voice, there was also a sharp mind for business. He started his own publishing company, founded SAR Records, and pushed for ownership in an industry that rarely wanted black performers holding that kind of control. In 1964, after hearing Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, he wrote, "A Change Is Gonna Come," a song that carried the ache of the civil rights era in a way almost no one else had managed. Then came that night. Cook had gone to the motel with Elisa Boyer. Hours later, Boyer ran from the room saying he had chased her. Motel manager Bertha Franklin said Cook burst into her office enraged and she shot him later, claiming she feared for her life. Police accepted that account quickly. The coroner's jury ruled the killing justifiable homicide. But almost from the start, the story left too many loose ends behind. His family rejected the official version. Friends questioned the speed of the investigation, the missing clothing, the missing money, the missing sense in the whole chain of events. How does a life that powerful end in a room that small and still leave less certainty than noise? He was 33. A Change Is Gonna Come was released after his death and would become bound forever to his name. The song kept rising while the details of that motel room never settled cleanly, and Sam Cooke's final hours remained suspended between official closure and a public that never really believed it understood what happened. Jimi Hendrix. The rooms at Electric Lady had only just begun to sound like the future Jimi Hendrix wanted. The studio in Greenwich Village opened in late August 1970, and he moved through it like a man finally stepping inside a place built from his own imagination. Tape was rolling on songs such as Freedom Dolly Dagger, Nightbird Flying, and straight-ahead pieces that pointed toward a new stretch of music still taking shape when the doors were barely open. That made the timing especially cruel because Hendrix was not standing at the end of his creative road. He had carved out a language on the guitar that changed rock almost on contact, first through the Jimi Hendrix Experience, then through landmarks such as Are You Experienced and Electric Ladyland with Monterey and Woodstock, turning his stage presence into something people still talk about as if it belonged to weather rather than performance. He carried all of that into London in September 1970. Still only 27, still restless, still full of half-finished work. Then the story narrowed to a flat at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill and a morning that never straightened itself back out. He was found unresponsive there on September 18th and taken to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 12:45 p.m. The post-mortem found that he had inhaled his own vomit and died of asphyxia while intoxicated with barbiturates. At the inquest, the coroner recorded an open verdict, saying there was not enough evidence to settle the exact circumstances. How do you imagine the next act when the door to it had only just opened? That question keeps circling back to the studio he had wanted so badly. Electric Lady remained standing. The tracks remained on tape. The plans remained scattered across a moment that never had time to become a full chapter. Hendrix left behind not only the albums that made his name permanent, but a stack of work from his last months that sounds like motion interrupted rather than a career winding down. The building opened on August 26, 1970. He was gone less than a month later. Donny Hathaway. In January 1979, Donny Hathaway was back in a studio with Roberta Flack trying to finish the kind of reunion people had been hoping for. Their duet, The Closer I Get to You, had climbed to number 2 on the Hot 100 in 1978, putting him back near the center of popular music after years when his work had been interrupted by illness. That return mattered because Hathaway had already built a catalog that felt far larger than his age. The Ghetto, This Christmas, A Song for You. Someday We'll All Be Free, and the Grammy-winning Where Is the Love with Flack. He had come out of church music, studied at Howard, worked with Curtis Mayfield's Curtum operation, arranged for major artists, and then sang with a depth that made even quiet lines feel lived in. At 33, he should have had years left to unfold. What ran alongside all of that was harder to hold on to from the outside. Britannica records that his success in the early 1970s was shadowed by depression, severe mood swings, and a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia with repeated hospitalizations following. The stories around him from that period do not sound like the usual wear and tear of fame. They sound like a gifted man losing his footing inside his own mind while still being asked to keep making beauty out of sound. On January 13, 1979, during that session for the new duet project, James Mattoom recalled Hathaway behaving irrationally and showing signs of delusion enough that the recording was shut down and he left. What chance does a comeback have when the collapse is happening inside the person everyone is waiting on? Hours later, he fell from the window of his 15th floor room at the Essex House in New York. Police ruled the death a suicide. This was not an artist disappearing after years of silence with nothing ahead. He had already found his way back onto the charts. He was working again with the partner who had helped create some of his most loved recordings. Two of the songs from those final sessions, Back Together Again and You Are My Heaven, were later released on Roberta Flack, featuring Donny Hathaway. The voice remained warm, centered, full of grace. The life around it had broken open. Then every holiday season, This Christmas kept returning, and Someday We'll All Be Free kept sounding less like a title than a prayer left hanging in the air after he was gone. Some names never leave the culture because the talent was too great, but also because the ending still feels unfinished.
This is what I look like.
These stories are not only about loss, they are about pressure, silence, family wounds, addiction, neglect, and the brutal cost of fame when warning signs go unanswered. Which death stayed with you the longest, and which story do you believe still carries the most unanswered pain? Share your thoughts in the comments. And for more powerful stories, untold history, and unforgettable Black icons brought to light, follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed.